Hi there, and welcome to Cloud Compliance, Assurance, and Auditing. My name is Andres Silva. I'm a Principal Specialist Solutions Architect here with the Cloud Operations teams at AWS. And for this presentation with me, I have Karthik Vishwanath, who you'll be meeting later on the presentation. He is the lead for the developers of AWS Config. He leads the development team. And we're very excited to talk to you about this topic of compliance in the cloud. Now, why is this an important topic that you should be interested on? Well, if you want to do any serious business in the cloud, you will have to meet requirements for some sort of compliance framework. Maybe HIPAA, maybe PCS, FedRAMP. Also, running any infrastructure at scale requires good governance, requires good security processes. So there's always going to be compliance in the conversation, and it is very important to run business in the cloud. Now, what is our goal with this presentation? What do we want you to take away from the presentation at the end? We would like you to understand better how you can use the different AWS services and features that we provide to simplify the process of achieving compliance in cloud environments. And to do that, we're going to walk you through some guidance, and we're going to do a dive deep into some of our services to help you understand that better. So let's get right to it, and let's get started. So here's the agenda of the topics that we're going to cover. We're going to talk about what are some of the challenges that we're learning from customers when it comes to compliance in the cloud. Then we're going to introduce you to a model that's called the 3 lines model. And we're going to explain what it is and how it helps you make better sense of how all of our services come together to help you. As we discuss that model, we're going to touch on 3 main topics: managing risk, overseeing risk, and providing assurance of risk management. Then at the end, we're going to review some key takeaways and things you can do to continue learning about this important topic. Now, in order to better understand this topic of compliance and the different services, I want to tell you a story, and it's about somebody that we're going to call Ed, right? Ed, like many of us, is learning about cloud compliance. Ed was just hired as a cybersecurity engineer for a big organization. Now, Ed brings a lot of experience in cybersecurity, in compliance, in managing infrastructure. However, he is new to the cloud. So he's new to learning how cloud operates and the different things that he has to keep in mind, and how to apply what he learns to now managing his infrastructure is a new journey that he's taking. And many of you may feel like this too. Now he's eager to learn and explore, like many of us also, right? And also he is responsible now for implementing compliance strategy at his organization. So maybe you feel identify a little bit with Ed, maybe some aspects of this character that I'm sharing with you. And the first thing when we're facing a challenge like this is what we like to do is learn more about the products, learn more about the challenge. So that's exactly what Ed does. You know, he starts talking to some of the different teams, meeting people, trying to understand what are the requirements for this new job he has. He has a big responsibility. So one of the first things he faces is as he starts learning about this new challenge or this new project that he has in front of him, that there are some challenges as he talks to some of the operation teams, as he talks to the developers. And maybe you've seen these challenges when it comes to compliance in the cloud. Let's go over them real quick, what he finds out very quickly. One of them is the dynamic landscape of the cloud. There are so many different services, managed services that behave in completely different ways. And for all those, you have to have compliance and you need to ensure compliance. That's a challenge sometimes. Also, the volume, variety, and velocity of resources in AWS and in the cloud. Think about an auto-scaling group. Think about an ECS cluster, an EKS cluster. They are constantly creating and destroying, terminating resources. And as that happens at a very fast speed, you need to ensure compliance. That's another challenge. The global footprint of where the workloads are running. Now we need to worry about workloads that are running on the other side of the world, and we need to make sure that we are meeting certain compliance requirements for that specific region. That could be a challenge. The pace of innovation. We are constantly releasing new services, and our organizations in customer environments that want to use those services, And you have to make sure that they're compliant as they start adopting these services. That could be a challenge also. Familiarity with the cloud. That's another one that Ed identified pretty quickly, right? A lot of the engineers and operations teams that are ramping up don't understand how cloud computing works, and they're learning. How do you, as that happens and they learn, how do you make sure that what they're doing is or fits within the compliance requirements you have? That could be a challenge also. And the different compliance and security needs for different organizations is another thing that Ed quickly realized. Some organizations are more concerned with maybe PCI, where others HIPAA. So there's different frameworks, and they don't apply the same way to all organizations. So that could also be a challenge. But, Ed is very determined, right? He's not new to learning, so he starts digging in. He starts reading documentation about AWS and the services we provide. And then all of a sudden, there's another challenge that comes up, right? And he faces what you see on the screen right now. Which one do I use for compliance? How do I get going? There are so many services. There's the AWS config, there's CloudTrail, there's Audit Manager, License Manager, Systems Manager. Which one do I use and how do I use it? Maybe you felt a little bit like Ed when you started researching about and learning about our services. But Ed continues to dig deeper, and he finds some blogs that we've published. He has an opportunity to attend a session that we did earlier this year on cloud compliance and assurance, and he learns about this concept of the 3 lines model. Now, what is the 3 lines model? The 3 lines model is a standard that is presented by the Institute of Internal Auditors, and it establishes that for an organization to implement effective compliance strategy or strong governance, they need to use what they describe as the 3 lines of defense. And when he starts digging deeper into this concept, it makes more sense how all of our services fit together. The first line of defense is where you manage risk. So this is where you define the controls that are going to identify and mitigate any risks in your infrastructure. And this is where services like AWS Config, CloudTrail, Systems Manager, License Manager, Backup, this is where they operate and help you define mechanisms to establish those controls, detect any non-compliant resources, and even remediate them or track them for remediation purposes. The second line of defense establishes that you need a way to oversee the risk. What that means is that after you have deployed all your controls and you're managing risk, you need to have a place where you can have a unified view of the risks, how they're being mitigated, how they're being assessed, so that you can have a single pane of glass on your security posture. And this is where services like Security Hub and even AWS Config also with some of its features come in, because these services allow you to quickly evaluate the security posture of all your AWS accounts in all regions for all resources and platforms that you're using, identify any risks, and possibly mitigate them immediately. And then the third line of defense is the line of providing assurance of risk management. And this is where at some point, an auditor is going to knock on your door and is going to say, well, you are supposed to be PCI compliant or you're supposed to be HIPAA compliant. Prove to me that you're indeed managing and overseeing risk properly. And that's where a new service that we released at reInvent last year called Audit Manager can help. Even CloudTrail can help there, because these services will help you collect all the evidence that you need for auditing purposes. And we'll do a deeper dive into what each one of these services does. But the key here is that in order to effectively understand how all of our services come together, Ed quickly realized that this is the framework he has to put it in, the 3 lines model. And now it all starts making sense. It all starts falling into the right place. Now he gets it, right? But then he says, well, how do I get started with the first line of defense? What should I do for the first line of defense? Well, let's talk a little bit about that. And let me highlight a few things that are important to understand to get you started with managing risk, that first line of defense. The first thing is that you should use Control Tower, if at all possible. Control Tower is the right place to start because it's going to simplify the implementation, the definition of all the security controls and everything you need to start managing risk. It's going to implement the account provisioning, it's going to establish guardrails, it's going to activate all the logging, auditing, it's going to activate config, all that for you, and it's going to give you a head start into managing risk. Then after that, what you want to do is automate, automate, automate. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, if you think back at the example that I mentioned earlier of the speed at which cloud resources operate, it is impossible to try to track things manually, right? So what you have to do is, as you implement your managed risk, you need to implement controls that allow you to detect things quickly and mitigate them if possible. So you need to take advantage of things like AWS config rules and remediation actions, which we're going to show you more in depth how they work. As part of that, you also need to look into compliance as code. Compliance as code is a mechanism that will allow you to establish your controls in a way that is defined by code, that can be reviewed, that can be passed through a pipeline, that can evaluate it and make sure it is what you required, and then deploy. That's going to speed up the mechanism of or the process of implementing your compliance requirements, because compliance is constantly changing. So you don't want to have to manually deploy these controls every single time. You want an effective way of defining them as code, review them, and publish them. And then the last thing is, you want to keep in mind that in order to manage risk effectively, there are two main things. There are preventive and detective controls. And let's talk about them now. Let's talk about preventive and detective controls. Let's start with preventive controls. What are preventive controls? When we talk about preventive controls, we mean that you establish mechanisms that allow you to, before things are created as cloud infrastructure, prevent their creation if they don't fit or meet the requirements for compliance. The way you do that is by implementing three main categories. The first one is, we have features and services that allow you to manage or control what things happen in your environment. And this is where services like AWS organizations with features like service control policies come in, because they allow you to define services that you can use, regions that you cannot use, specific operations that you cannot do. So that would prevent a user from doing something they're not supposed to do. You can extend that with IAM policies that get very granular and specify, how things, or what permissions an individual has to do things in cloud infrastructure. And then, of course, we already talked about Control Tower as an important mechanism on that first category of managing. Then after that, what you do is you make sure your provisioning is tidy up, right? Like, provisioning is how things are going to be created. So you want to avoid just giving everybody free rein to the console and let them do whatever they want. You want to use some sort of infrastructure as code mechanism like CloudFormation or Service Catalog, or even a lot of our customers use Terraform, and make that the way you provision infrastructure, because that will allow you to establish processes of reviewing, storing your infrastructure as code, which will in turn allow you to take advantage of the third category, which is where compliance comes in. And in here, you can use tools like CloudFormation Guard, or even OPA is very popular with customers that use Terraform, where you can actually define rules that implement those controls for compliance. And then before any CloudFormation template is provisioned, it gets evaluated against those rules. And then you can stop the provisioning if it doesn't meet the requirements. We're not going to do a deep dive of CloudFormation Guard, but I want to show you real quick how it looks. So in this example that you see on the screen, this is a CloudFormation Guard rule that has been implemented or defined for volumes. So in order for a volume that's defined in CloudFormation to be allowed to pass, it needs to meet the requirements that are defined here. It needs to be encrypted, the size, the volume type. So you have a lot of flexibility in how do you define that. Now, how do you implement this? This is the way you implement it. So let me show you a quick diagram. So you start with a CloudFormation template. So your development teams or the people that run operations will create that CloudFormation template. But what happens is, in order to deploy that CloudFormation template, they have to use some sort of CI/CD mechanism. In this case, we use the example of using CodePipeline. And with CodePipeline would kickstart the process of deploying the template as soon as it detects a merge to a specific branch in a repo. And then it's going to have a step that is going to run code build to run the CloudFormation Guard tool against the template with the rules that have been defined for compliance. Once it's run or executed, it's going to say pass or did not pass. As you can see here, what happened? Did it pass? It didn't pass? If it did not pass, then we stop, right? Nothing happens. An error is generated, and the user has to go back and figure out why it failed and fix it before it can be deployed. Now, if it passes, then we have it clear so that the code build can pass it to the next step, which will create the resources in the infrastructure. There we go. So that's how it works, right? That's how a very simple implementation of CloudFormation Guard can help you implement preventive compliance. Now, we also need to talk about detective compliance. So to do that, I want to invite Karthik to talk to us a little bit about AWS Config and how you can use it to implement detective controls. Karthik, please take it away.
Thank you, Andres. Let's first take a look at what is AWS Config. There's three value propositions with AWS Config. The first is providing you the ability to track changes to your configuration. The second is compliance, providing you the ability to track compliance of your resources. And the third is visualization. With visualization, you can actually see your compliance results, your changes to your record, your configuration items, right, across multiple accounts and multiple regions in a single pane of glass. Right? So that's the value with visualization. And you can also write queries, SQL queries to actually get the data. What I'll be talking about is the first two items, which is tracking of your resources as well as compliance. And then later in the presentation, Andreas will walk you through visualization with AWS Config. So let's dive in. The first primitive with AWS Config is config recording. Right? So anytime you're working with AWS Config, you are going to be enabling config recording. Right? What is config recording? Config recording is the service by way of which you can track changes to your configuration items. And anytime you create a resource or you update a resource, right, we're going to create what's called as a configuration item, right? And we will deliver it to an S3 bucket that you've chosen. And you will also be able to see a snapshot, a timeline view of how your configuration resources have been changing. Today, with AWS Config Recording, we support up to 114 resource types that we track. That's spawning across 40 different AWS services. And we're continuously adding more resource types that's integrated with AWS Config. You not only can record AWS Config resources, but you can also record third-party resources using config recording. The way you do that is with a feature that we call as custom config resources, where you can now bring in your resources either in on-premise or wherever else. Right? You can bring them into AWS Config where you can track these resources that's residing on your on-premise or anywhere else. You can track them with config recording. Right? So that's config recording, which is like a fundamental for config. The next service that is built on top of config recording is what we call as config rules. What is config rules? So config rules is basically the service by way of which we will evaluate every single resource, right, for compliance. Right? One of the things that actually, one of the things that we hear from customers is like, hey, what is config rules? Like, how is this different from managed policies? Right? Config rules is the example I use is config rules is a technical term. Right? The English word for config rules is policies. Right? So you are going to define policies that you want your resources to adhere to. And config rules is the way we are implementing these policies that you want your resources to adhere to. Right? So if you look at config rules, there are two types of config rules. One is managed and the other one is custom. Right? What I mean by managed rules is today AWS offers over 200 plus config rules, right, out of the box config rules that you can deploy. Right? Let's take an example. Let's say you have a policy where you're saying all my data that is stored in my EBS volume needs to be encrypted. That's your policy. The way you will implement that policy is you would deploy a managed rule for EBS volume encryption. So now, anytime an EBS volume is created or updated, your config recording is basically going to track that resource, right? It's going to generate a configuration item. And as soon as that resource is either created or updated, and the resource is tracked, config rules will now process the managed rule that you have deployed against this resource that was created or updated. And it's going to check to see, hey, is this EBS volume, is it set up for always encrypting data or not encrypting the data? So let's say if your EBS volume was created so that all the data that is being stored is going to be encrypted, right? Now that particular resource is compliant, right? Now, if the volume was created in such a way that the data is not going to be encrypted, now that resource is marked as non-compliant. With config rules, we also have the capability where you can auto-remediate non-compliant resources. Right? So, and obviously, when you're having these policies, like I said earlier, we have 200 plus policies. We're not going to be able to cover every single policy that you would want deployed, right? Which is why we have custom rules. So with custom rules, you can now write your own config rule that you want, and you deploy that as a Lambda function. Right? So this way, with managed rules and custom rules, you can now ensure that all your compliance requirements can be met. Right? So that's something Jed is going to learn. Okay, so that's what I need to use. Now, this is as part of deploying the rules, right? So now, when do I evaluate these rules? Right? That's the other dimension of when do the rules get evaluated. So you have two options. One is change triggered. The second is periodic. With change triggered, if you go back to the example that I gave you, right? That is what we call as a change triggered rule. As soon as a resource is created or updated, we're going to evaluate that resource for compliance against the config rule that you have deployed for that particular resource type. So this is what we call as continuous compliance, right? So now as the resources are created or updated, you're able to continuously check for compliance. You're always up to date, right? So that's when you would deploy a change triggered rule. There's the other use case where your auditor might come and say, hey, every 24 hours, I want to make sure that I have evidence that your resource is compliant. So now what we do in that particular case is you would deploy a periodic rule where you decide the frequency. So it could be every 24 hours or it could be every 12 hours. So at that frequency that which you have defined, you are now going to execute the config rule. And if no change has been made, the previous state will continue. So if you were compliant 24 hours back and the resource has not changed, you continue to remain compliant. So that's the value prop with periodic rules, where you have this at specified time intervals, you have enough evidence to say if your resource is compliant or non-compliant. All right. So now that we know config rules, right? So the next part is how are other services leveraging config rules? So you can deploy config rules, but what you will also find is there are other services in AWS that provide compliance-related capability, right? They are also built on top of config rules. Let's take the case of Security Hub and Backup, right? So Security Hub has this primitive called Security Hub controls. Behind the scenes, it is nothing but a config rule, right? So it's not presented to you as a config rule, but it's presented as a Security Hub control, but it's nothing but a config rule. Similarly, with backup, we have these backup audit manager policies, right? They are nothing but config rules behind the scenes, right? With Control Tower, right, you have these detective guardrails, right? Andrew has talked about preventative guardrails, right? So we also have detective guardrails with Control Tower. Again, they are nothing but config rules. So you also have other services like Audit Manager and Firewall Manager. Again, they're under the cover for the compliance evaluations. They all use config rules. Right? We'll talk about Conformance Pack in a minute. One point I want to call out with regards to pricing, right? So, and we've heard multiple customers ask us these questions where when you're deploying Security Hub or Backup, right, In your pricing bill, you would notice a line item for config recording, but you would not notice a line item for config rules, right? The reason is the way that gets presented is it's as a security of control or a backup policy, right? So you will not see a config rule line item, but instead you're seeing the security of control or the backup policy as the line item as a replacement for config rules. But behind the scenes, it's effectively a config rule, right? But for all of these services, one of the core features that you have to always be enabling is config recording, right? So sometimes if you're wondering, it's, hey, why am I being charged for config recording? As you can see, without config recording, we would not be able to deliver these compliance evaluations, because for me to be able to record that resource change, I need config recording enabled, right? So which is why config rules is basically the core for all your compliance evaluations. Right. Let's dig a little bit deeper into conformance packs. Right? So what is a conformance pack? So conformance pack is nothing but it's a collection of rules. Right? So the idea of conformance pack is it's going to simplify your deployment experience. So I mentioned conformance pack is a collection of rules. So you can have up to 130 config rules in a single conformance pack. The real use case is, so let's say I want to deploy 100 rules in multiple accounts, right? So you go to account 1, account 2, account 3. So every time you have to ensure that you're actually deploying all the 100 rules, right? You do not want to have any cause for a human error, right? That's where conformance pack comes in handy, right? So you do this exercise once where you ensure that you have now coded all your 100 rules into this single conformance pack. From now onwards, you're just dealing with that one entity or that primitive of a conformance pack, right? You know that if I go and deploy conformance pack A, and the conformance pack A has all the 100 rules that I want, then I'm not missing out on config rules for my account. So you can now deploy the conformance pack across multiple accounts or across an organization, right? As one click, you can deploy it across your organization. So that's a great value proposition with conformance pack, where it simplifies your deployment. Also, if you're deploying across an AWS organization, you can use a delegated admin account or the master account to actually deploy these conformance packs. Another benefit with conformance pack is once you deploy the conformance pack, right, these rules are immutable rules. Right? So now you can ensure that the user or member account doesn't accidentally delete one of the rules. With the conformance pack today, we have more than 50 plus conformance packs that you can actually directly deploy. The other value add of a conformance pack is we also start using conformance pack for compliance regimes or operational best practices. Right? So one of the operational best practices we have is an S3. Right? So you have an S3 operational best practices conformance pack. But there are also some compliance regimes like HIPAA, right? And some of these where they require you to have a manual process, like let's say an auditor has gone and verified something. Right? So we have this category of rules that is today available only in a conformance pack called as process check rules, where you're not checking for compliance of a particular resource, but instead you're actually checking if a particular process was completed or not. Right? So then it would just be, hey, the auditor verified this. I have the signature, so let me go and add this to the conformance pack. You can add a process check rule, a generic one which says verified by the auditor. And now you just go do a put config rule and say, yep, that is compliant. Right? So it gives you that ability when you're having some compliance regimes where there is this, there are these other requirements that are beyond just verifying what value of the resources, if they are compliant or not, but there are these manual checks that you have to do. Right? So that's the value it gives. The other benefit with conformance pack is we launched this feature this year, is the ability for you to get the status of the entire pack. Right? So let's go back to the example. Right? If you were deploying 100 rules, right? And now if I want to ensure that, hey, is my account compliant or all these 100 rules compliant, you have to do an AND function of each and every single rule, right? With the conformance pack, we actually give you that compliance status for the conformance pack directly, right? So it simplifies the reporting. And finally, like I mentioned earlier, we have more than 50 plus conformance pack, both for operation best practices as well as for various compliance regimes. So let's kind of put all of these back together, right? So Andrew's talked about detective controls and how config is used there. So we talked in detail about config rules, right, as well as conformance pack and how they help with the detective controls. And the same point again is here what we're checking is with these rules and conformance packs is after the resource has been created, we're now checking for if that particular resource that was created is compliant against the policy or the config rules that we have deployed. Right? One of the benefits with Conformance Pack, as I mentioned earlier, is Conformance Pack, we're starting to see a lot of customers deploy Conformance Pack based on different scenarios, right? Where, hey, I'm running a particular campaign, so I want to make sure now I'm deploying it for this subset of accounts and making sure that I'm now compliant and I've completed my campaign. Or we also see for operational best practices as well as compliance regimes. Another point which I want to address here, which comes up quite a bit, is if you look at Security Hub standards versus conformance packs, there is similarity between the two. And one of the things that Andreas started talking about, and as you'll see in the rest of the session when he talks about various services, is there are different ways in which you can solve the problem, right? And there is also a user persona aspect to it, right? Depending on what your role is, you're going to pick the appropriate feature. Right? And for us, we take an agnostic standard in terms of we're providing various services, and you pick the service that works for your particular use case, right? With Security Hub standards versus conformance pack, it's very similar where with Security Hub standards, we provide an opinionated way of, hey, now for HIPAA, you should now go and deploy these different controls. Right? With Conformance Pack, it starts there. Right? With Conformance Pack, we're basically taking the same set of rules or controls that Security Hub standards have, and you have the similar sort of config rules in a Conformance Pack. But it allows you to go one step further where if you were to determine saying, yeah, these set of rules don't work for me, or it's not applicable for my particular environment. So instead, I want to add something else, right? So with Conformance Pack, you can now gives you the flexibility to extend beyond what was prescribed, right? So the way I think of Conformance Pack is it's a hybrid between an opinionated solution and a do-it-yourself, where we're giving you get started. You're not starting at zero. Where we give you for HIPAA, I'm picking that as an example. Here are a set of config rules that you need to deploy, right? As well as process check rules you need to deploy for HIPAA. And we're giving you a starting point, right? But you don't need to deploy that, right? It's just as a reference. Now you can add or delete to that. So that's the difference where if you're looking for an opinionated way and a more managed solution, Security Hub standards is your option. But if you're looking for a do-it-yourself type of solution with a head start, Conformance Pack would be the solution that you would use. So back to our friend Ed. So one thing Ed is going to realize in this journey is config is the core for compliance. So I need to ensure that I learn more about AWS config recording and config rules, as well in remediation and conformance packs while I'm coming up with my compliance strategy. And then later in the session, you'll see Andrew's talk about visualization and where you'll see how config brings all of these aspects together. So learning about AWS config is critical for my success here. So before we move on, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into AWS config and talk about what were some of the features that we launched in the past 12 months. Right? One feature is we support AWS KMS encryption with ES3 buckets. So previously, what we would do is prior to this feature is we would leverage the server-side encryption on S3 using the AES-256 key. Right? With this feature launch, now you can provide the KMS encryption key as well, and we would honor that. We're continuing to add more managed rules. We've launched 34 new rules this year, and the numbers are only going to keep increasing. We talked about Conformance Pack, right, where now we have this compliance status for a Conformance Pack, as well as that compliance status is available as a CI. So now you can see the timeline for the Conformance Pack status as well. We've integrated support of your conformance pack with aggregators as well. So you can see the conformance pack changes as well as the compliance status of your conformance pack on your aggregator. On the advanced query, so if you're writing these queries that you want to query the data from your aggregator, and if you're writing complex queries, you don't have to keep rewriting those queries. We have this feature called Save Query, by way of which once you write the query, you can now save it, so it saves you sometimes more usability feature. And also another usability feature, which is pretty strongly asked by a lot of customers last year, was like the pagination support for the results. And it was interesting. It was like, it's a very simple feature, but the number of thank you notes that we've got once we've launched this feature from customers was very interesting. So that's a quick summary of the various features that we have with AWS Config that we've launched in the past year. With that, let me hand it over back to Andreas to walk you through the rest of the session.
Right. Thank you very much, Karthik. We appreciate all those details about AWS Config. There's one more thing I wanted to talk to you about regarding AWS Config. We recently published a blog that I think it would be interesting for you to review as part of your strategy for managing risk. And it's a blog that shows how you can use custom config rules with OPA, or Open Policy Agent. This is an open source platform that is very popular with users of container workloads because it implements a policy language called Rego, which makes it very easy to define policies to evaluate anything that's expressed in basically JSON format. So we have a sample out there. You can scan this QR code, and essentially what we're doing is implementing or allowing you to define a rule to evaluate a resource using Rego, but then execute it through AWS Config rules, which is actually pretty cool. I'm very excited about. So I encourage you to take a look at it as another option to simplify how you write your compliance logic. You can always also, of course, use Lambda and write your logic in code. But this is just another option that makes it a lot simpler. And our goal is just to show you the art of the possible with custom config rules. Now what I want to do is I want to show you a demo of how you can use some of the things we've discussed with AWS Config, with remediation actions, with Conformance Pack, put it all together so you can deploy one control for compliance purposes. Let's take a look at the demo, please. So let me show you a demo of how you can define a control to manage risk in a detective way using AWS Config. So the first thing I want to show you is how you deploy that control. And I'm here at the AWS Config console, and I'm going to go to Rules. Now let's imagine that I have to comply with HIPAA in my organization. And as part of that, I'm going to deploy a rule that validates that my S3 buckets are encrypted. So we have a rule for that, and all I have to do is click Add Rule, and then type here the name of the rule that I'm looking. In this case, I'm looking for this specific rule, which is called S3 Bucket Server-Side Encryption Enable. So I'm going to type the name of it, I'm going to select it, and then I'm just going to click Next here. Now here I have the option of giving it a name. So I'm just going to use the same name that is provided there, but I'm going to append it with demo, just so that I know that's the one that I'm working with. The other options that are specified here are when it will be evaluated. In this case, I am going to select that the scope of changes is whenever the resource changes, and it applies to S3 bucket. I can also specify a unique S3 bucket if I'm interested in only evaluating a specific bucket. That's another option that we have. So I'm just going to leave all the defaults and click Next, and then I'm going to go ahead and deploy my rule. What's going to happen is AWS Config is going to go and deploy that rule for me. All right, so here's my rule that I've deployed, that I just deployed, the S3 Bucket Server-Side Encryption Enabled demo. I'm going to click on it, and then I'm going to see that it has already detected a number of resources that are not compliant. Now, what I can do is, because this is a non-negotiable thing in my organization, I can go ahead and deploy a remediation action. The way you do that is you go into the rule and you select this option here in Actions that's called Manage Remediation. And it's Manage Remediation, I can specify an systems manager document that will perform the necessary API actions to fix that resource. In this case, the console already has suggested for me the remediation action that I should use, which is AWS enable S3 bucket encryption. So I'm just going to leave that at the default. And I must make sure that the resource ID is the bucket name that will be used. The only other thing that I have to specify here is the role that will be used to perform that action. So, and that's already been populated for me here. So all I have to do now is save the changes. And now I have a remediation action that I can use for those buckets. The way I know this is working now is if I select a specific bucket that I want to fix, the remediation action button will be enabled. Now, you can deploy remediation actions either an automatic way, which will mean as soon as the resource is detected, it will be fixed, or they can be deployed in manual mode. And this is something you specify in the definition. And then you'll have the option to come into the console and decide when you're going to fix it. So that's how you deploy the control and the remediation action. Now, how do you take that to the next level and deploy that rule and that remediation action as part of a conformance pack? Let me show you that real quick. So what I have here is my HIPAA conformance pack that I've already downloaded the sample. I've been working on it, and I've been modifying it to fit my specific needs. So what I want to do is I want to add this rule for server-side encryption enabled right here, as you can see. And I also want to add the remediation action. Now, what I have here, a conformance pack, is essentially a CloudFormation template. What I have here is the definition of the rule, and I have the definition of the remediation action. And as you would think, in the rule itself is just the definition of the rule name, what resources are going to apply, the same kind of things that we specify when we deploy the rule. For the remediation action, is very similar. We just specify the rule that it applies to, and we need to make sure that we have the right role here with the proper account ID. So in my sample here, and let me scroll and find it, I've already added here the rule, as you can see, for server-side encryption enabled. I also have added my remediation action. And with the proper account ID, the proper role, we need to make sure that role exists. So now I can just go ahead and save this. And I can go back to, now that I've modified my template, I can go back to conformance packs here in the console. And I can click on deploy conformance packs. I can select upload a template, which is the template that I just worked on. And I can either upload it from an S3 bucket, but I'm going to upload it from my local machine. I'm going to choose the file here, and I'm going to select the file that I just updated. And I'm going to click next. And for demo, HIPAA is what I'm going to enter for the name, just to keep it simple. And I'm going to click next, and I click deploy. And as simple as that, now you are deploying your brand new conformance pack with the remediation action and everything configured. Now, I've already deployed one here so that I show you how it looks of the exact same one. Once it's deployed, the first thing you're going to see is you have an overall compliance status for the conformance pack. And then as we dig into the specific conformance pack, we can see which rules that are part of that conformance pack are non-compliant. And as we dive deep into these rules, so here we have the rule that we just deployed. And as you can see, it has a remediation action associated with it. So I can go into this rule. And the first thing that I want to mention as we go into rules that are deployed by conformance packs, that it warns me that this rule was created by a conformance pack, so I can't edit the rule. This is where the immutability comes in. But I also can see that a remediation action associated with it. So when I select one of these resources, I can go ahead and click remediate, and it will start the process of remediating. If I click remediate and I refresh, it says the action executed successfully. And then I refresh again. Oh, so it completed. The action was executed successfully. So now this bucket that was before non-compliant has now been fixed. So this is how you can deploy a control to manage risk using AWS config, deploy a remediation action to automate the process, and then make that part of a conformance pack that you can deploy across multiple accounts and multiple regions. Now, when we talk about managing risk, we also have to talk about other couple of services that are important. One of them is Systems Manager. And I want to take a minute to talk to you about it because it's an important part of managing risk. Why? Well, there are a few features of Systems Manager that are important to managing risk. Now, Systems Manager, as a quick review, is what we like to call at AWS our Operations Hub. It's a service that does three things very well. It first allows you to group resources in a way that's meaningful for your operations. It then allows you to visualize important data about those resources, about the workloads that you're running on those resources. And third, it allows you to take action to manage those resources. So there are some features within, and Systems Manager has a lot of features, but we're going to focus on a few that are very important. One of them for managing risk. One of them is Quick Setup. And Quick Setup is a feature that allows you to perform in a simplified way certain configuration actions for services in AWS. And one of those is AWS config. So if you had a large environment where you needed to deploy AWS config and you were not using Control Tower, because Control Tower does that automatically for you, you could take advantage of Quick Setup to deploy the AWS config recorder, which essentially activates the recording of resources in AWS in a very easy way. It also allows you to deploy conformance packs in a very easy way and deploy them across different accounts and across multiple regions. So that's why it's so important to the story of managing risk and compliance. The other one that I want to call your attention to is automation. What is automation? Automation is a feature that allows you to design repetitive IT workflows that you need to perform on AWS infrastructure. And this is the engine behind remediation actions that we showed you in the demo a minute ago. So you can write in automation the specific API actions that you want to execute and that you could potentially use to fix a resource that is non-compliant. In the demo, we show you the example of an S3 bucket that is not encrypted and using a Systems Manager automation document to call the API that encrypts that bucket. So that's why that one is so important. Then we have Run Command and State Manager, which are tools that allow you to extend the power of automation all the way down to an EC2 instance. So think of a scenario where you have a large set of EC2 instances and you need to change a setting in them to make them compliant. Well, that's where Run Command allows you to write a very simple document that executes the automated steps to do that. And then you can do it very quickly at scale on all those resources. When you combine that with inventory and patch management, now you can ensure you're assessing all your resources and making sure that they are compliant with very simple steps, not only in terms of patching, but also in terms of the applications that are running, maybe network configurations requirements that they need to meet. So when we talk about managing risk, we need to talk about Systems Manager and take advantage of these features. Another service that is very important is CloudTrail when we discuss managing risk. CloudTrail is our managed audit trail platform. Essentially, it tracks everything that happens on an AWS account, records it, and then you can review it. It creates a trail for every single action, like from logging into the console, performing API actions that are done through the console, through the API, through the command line. Everything is recorded. CloudTrail is so important to us that when you open a brand new AWS account, it's already enabled by default to track 90 days for you. However, we do encourage customers to create their own trails so that they can keep longer than 90 days. But CloudTrail provides two types of trails that you can configure. You can configure what we call a management trail and a data events trail. The management trails is going to track all the operations done on resources, like creating them and modify them. And the data events is going to track operations that happen within a resource. Think like of an S3 bucket. And if you want to track every read operation, every delete or write operation on a bucket, you can take advantage of data events to do that. In fact, many of the compliance frameworks that are out there require you to have a mechanism to track operations on files, and audit trail, and the capabilities of data events will help you to do specifically that. So this is a very important service when we're discussing managing risk at scale. Now, Ed is getting the story, right? Remember, we're talking about Ed and his journey through learning all these things. He's learning about managing risk. He's learning about config. He's learning about CloudTrail now and Systems Manager. He's putting the picture together. He has a very good grasp on how to manage risk. But now let's talk about the second line of defense. And he's wondering, well, good, perfect, but how do I get started with overseeing risk? What are some of the options that I have to get started? Let's talk about a couple of them. The first one is within AWS Config. Yeah, AWS Config is also part of the story related to overseeing risk, because there's a couple of features in AWS Config that will help you precisely do that. One of them is aggregators. Now, what do aggregators do? Well, an aggregator will help you, once you configure it, it will take all the data that is being recorded across multiple regions and across multiple accounts and centralize it into a single place. You have the ability of seeing this data in the console, in a dashboard. It will show you what resources are not compliant, what resources are compliant. It will give you information about specific resource configuration. All that is very valuable to the second line of defense, which is to have an effective mechanism that you use to oversee risk. On top of that, you can use a feature called Advanced Query. An Advanced Query allows you to write queries using the very familiar SQL syntax that will allow you to take advantage of that data that is being collected by the aggregator, and then construct queries that extract specific information that you're interested in obtaining from the data that we're collecting. We provide a number of sample queries, and you can create your own queries and save them also. And by combining this, you can have a very good set of tools that allow you to oversee risk. But the other powerful tool that we need to talk about when we are discussing the second line of defense and overseeing risk is Security Hub. Security Hub, once you turn it on, will give you a comprehensive view of all your security alerts and your security posture across all your AWS accounts and regions. You will have a single place that aggregates, organizes, and prioritizes your security alerts, all the findings across all these different accounts and regions. It collects that data from different services. It collects the data from CloudTrail. It collects the data from AWS Config, from GuardDuty, from Inspector, from Amazon Macie, from IAM Access Analyzer. All these data funnel into Security Hub. It creates these findings. It gives you clear alerts. It even integrates with partner solutions to aggregate data from them also. And then you can take actions on those. Again, this covers the second line of defense that allows you to have a clear overview of your security posture across your entire organization. Now, we talked about the first line, the second line. Ed is feeling better. He has a good grasp on how things work. He feels like he can start using some of those services on the first and second line of defense. But he knows that at some point, he's going to get audited, right? So he needs to prepare mentally for that, and he wants to learn a little bit more about how he can get ready for it. How do I get ready for my audits, right? How do I take care of that third line of defense? Let's talk about that, and let's focus on a service that we released at reInvent last year. It's called AWS Audit Manager. And AWS Audit Manager essentially will help you collect all the evidence that you need for when an audit comes up. Now, this is why it's so important to understand the foundational services that we discussed in the first line of defense, the second line of defense, things like Config, CloudTrail, Systems Manager, because all the data and all the evidence is going to be on those services. And what Audit Manager is going to allow you to do is collect that information and prepare it for auditors. How does it do that? The way it does that is by providing you with frameworks. Those frameworks are a collection of control sets. And there's a framework for the different types of compliance regimes. Like there will be a framework for PCI, another one for HIPAA, and so on and so forth. And those frameworks contain that set of control sets. Some of those control sets have controls that are automatically collect information by using AWS Config, by using Security Hub, by using CloudTrail. And there's also manual controls there that you need to validate to make sure that you have a security guard at the door. Maybe that's part of the of a compliance framework requirement. There's no way to validate that automatically, well, at least not yet, right? But so we provide you with a mechanism in Audit Manager to validate that and confirm it. Once that's established, that framework can be deployed and it creates what's called an assessment. That assessment will start collecting all that information for you. It will make it available. It will give you the opportunity to confirm. And then as this happens and you continue to collect that information, the day that you need to report to an auditor, you just have to click one button and we deliver all the documents necessary to an S3 bucket in PDF format, and you just have to give them to an auditor. So Audit Manager simplifies greatly the process of collecting all that evidence and making it ready for that third line of defense. So as you can see, if we keep in mind these 3 lines model, it will greatly help us to understand how the services come together. Now, let's talk about some takeaways now, things that we want you to take away from this presentation. Well, we want you to keep in mind first that 3 lines model, right? How it helps you understand where our different services fit and how you can use them to achieve compliance. Number 2, we want you to understand how important config is and how is the core of the compliance evaluation. It was interesting to see how Karthik explained how all these services are related to it and how config is the foundation of it and how they all can work to help you. And number 3, we want you to think about all the wide range of options that we have for compliance. We talked about preventive compliance with CloudFormation Guard. We talked about AWS config, remediation actions, rules, conformance packs, aggregators, advanced query. All these are things that are going to help you. On top of that, the oversee risk with Security Hub and Audit Manager. All these tools can help you achieve compliance. They give you the flexibility to customize things to your specific needs, which we feel is very important, and they work in a very efficient way. We want to encourage you to continue learning about this topic. So I want to share with you a couple of QR codes here that you can scan right now that will take you to 2 repositories that we have on GitHub that have samples that will help you see how you can deploy things like config, conformance packs, how you can implement Security Hub, how you can deploy Audit Manager, how you can deploy controls in Audit Manager that are related to a conformance pack. There's a lot of good, interesting samples there that are well documented and should get you going to learn more about this topic of compliance at scale. With that, we want to thank you for listening to our presentation. We hope it has helped you to understand better how you can achieve compliance in AWS. And hopefully now you feel better prepared as Ed to take on the compliance challenge.